President, in talking about the continuing recession tonight, you have blamed mistakes of the past, and you have blamed the Congress. Does any of the blame belong to you?
Yes, because for many years I was a Democrat.
In the early 70s, the United States was experiencing its worst economic decline since the Great Depression. Deindustrialization hit the economy hard and resulted in massive unemployment. In the Rust Belt, unemployment was as high as 30% in some areas. Factories were abandoned overnight. America also faced an energy crisis. The rising price of oil crippled many industries, like car manufacturing. American oil companies had initially received massive profits increases after the price of oil rose, but the government placed a tax to stop the companies from gaining inordinate amounts of wealth. This tax was known as the windfall profits tax, and it did more to hurt the economy than it did protect it. The government said they did it to prevent unfair profits gained from the oil shortage, but the tax ended up hurting the companies who were subject to it. The government gained massive amounts of money, which went towards paying its deficit. Well, the price of oil rose and the amount of oil produced by American companies shrank. The Carter administration was inept at dealing with the recession. The highest tax rate was 70% for the wealthiest Americans, but despite that, the government still had a large deficit. It appeared as though the economy was destined to take the slow path out of recession, but this was unpopular, and so too was President Carter. In the election season of 1980, the conservative candidate, Ronald Reagan, had his response to the Democratic policies of the previous decade.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Ronald Reagan won the election with the promise to restore the American dream. As he had said during debates and during his campaign, Reagan saw large government as the enemy of economic prosperity. Ronald Reagan was quick to implement his economic plan. The economic principles known as Reaganomics centered on four main ideas. The first was to reduce inflation.
Now, we've just had 2 years of back-to-back double-digit inflation. Here is a dollar such as you earned, spent, or saved in 1960. And here is a quarter, a dime, and a penny. 36 cents. That's what this $1960 is worth today.
The second key point of Reaganomics was to reduce the regulation of the economy.
Regulations adopted by government with the best of intentions have added $666 to the cost of an automobile. It is estimated that altogether, regulations of every kind on shopkeepers, farmers, and major industries add $100 billion or more to the cost of the goods and services we buy.
The third and most controversial point was to reduce government spending.
Before we reach the day when we can reduce the debt ceiling, we may, in spite of our best efforts, see a national debt in excess of $1 trillion.
The final and most popular initiative of Reaganomics was to lower taxes, especially on the wealthy and on businesses.
Excessive taxation of individuals has robbed us of incentive and made overtime unprofitable.
The two major tax legislations of Ronald Reagan's presidency were the Economic Recovery Tax Act in 1981 and the Tax Reform Act in 1986. The Economic Recovery Tax Act lowered the tax rates for all Americans. The highest tax rate went from 70% to 50%, while the lowest tax rate went from 14% to 11%. And the Tax Reform Act of 1986 simplified the tax system and lowered further the highest tax rate from 50% to 28%. Ronald Reagan's economic policies were extremely popular. In the election of 1984, Reagan won in a landslide, winning every state except for Minnesota and Washington, D.C. The country believed in Reagan and in his economic policies. But just how successful were Reagan's policies, and did Reaganomics accomplish its goals? It's important to remember that during the era of Reaganomics, the US was in the midst of a recession. Many economists say that the recession of the 70s didn't really hit until the mid-80s. With that in mind, whether or not you attribute good or bad signs of economic health to the recession, or to Reaganomics, usually depends on what party you support. The facts are this. This table shows that during Reagan's presidency in 1986, the United States government pulled in more money than did Carter's administration in 1979. This is significant because Reagan's administration cut taxes to an extremely low amount, and by 1986, the highest tax rate would have been 50%. Even with these low tax rates, the government still pulled in more money. This is because there was an overall increase in wealth and income in the US. The economy grew and increased the revenue gained from taxes. Reaganomics left other good marks. The unemployment rate was 5.4% by the end of Reagan's presidency. Poverty had peaked in 1983 thanks to recession, but was significantly lower by the end of Reagan's second term. There is one other unignorable factor of Reaganomics, and that is the expansion of the deficit. Although reducing government spending was one of the goals of Reaganomics, it never happened. This meant that spending increased without any reciprocating increase in revenue. With government spending increasing and the revenue not being able to keep up, the deficit grew by a massive amount, toppling over $1 trillion by the end of Reagan's presidency. Overall, there is little that can be said to defend such egregious deficit spending. However, it was on this deficit spending that the economy was put back on track and the recession was handled. 20 million jobs were created under Reagan's presidency, and inflation was brought down from 11% to 4%. Furthermore, a look at the history of government spending shows that the deficit was eliminated under President Clinton in the 90s. None of the money that was spent restoring the economy in the 80s remains. With a loose adherence to economic principles, one could say that the debt used to save us has been paid. And thanks for watching.
The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, look, in my country I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country.